9 legendary Golden Age sirens who suffered catastrophic physical declines. The blinding spotlights of Tinseltown have always worshipped at the altar of youth, immortalising porcelain skin and symmetrical features on silver nitrate film as if these women were immune to biology. However, the brutal, unyielding march of time eventually hunts everyone down, and it does not spare the goddesses who once ruled the silver screen. Today we are ripping the bandage off Hollywood's obsession with perfection to reveal the shocking metamorphoses of 9 iconic actresses whose twilight years were tragic rather than golden. We are not talking about growing old gracefully with a few laugh lines or a touch of grey hair here and there. We are discussing devastating rapid physical collapses that left tabloids screaming and loyal fans in a state of absolute disbelief. While their movies froze their beauty in time, their mirrors reflected a harsh, crumbling reality. From celebrated bombshells who desperately clung to a seductive image long after the magic had faded away, to cinema royalty utterly dismantled by substance abuse and the crushing pressure of fame, these are the gut-wrenching final acts of the industry's most stunning leading ladies. And you need to brace yourself for our number 1 spot. Her physical deterioration was so extreme and disturbing that even her inner circle walked right past her without realising who she was in her final days. You are clueless about how to hustle for a meal. You cannot keep your mouth shut to save your life. You are barely capable of laying low outside the city limits. Save it, I have forgotten more about surviving chaos than you will ever manage to learn in a lifetime. Number 9, Veronica Lake. A journey from a national obsession to a complete ghost. Let's rewind to 1941, a year when no hairstyle in the United States was more iconic or requested than Veronica Lake's peekaboo cut. We are talking about that luxurious, cascading blonde wave that crashed seductively over one eye, hiding secrets and breaking hearts. It triggered a literal mania with women stampeding into beauty parlours from coast to coast, demanding to be transformed into the Lake archetype. As the femme fatale of noir masterpieces like This Gun for Hire and the star of satires like Sullivan's Travels Lake wasn't merely a celebrity, she was the blueprint for cool. Armed with symmetrical perfection, a smoky presence and that trademark mane, Lake projected an icy, mysterious sexuality that the camera lenses absolutely devoured. Standing at a mere 4 feet and 11 inches, she was a pocket-sized stick of dynamite wrapped in silk and glamour. The studio marketing machine branded her the girl with the perfect face. And honestly, at the time, nobody on the planet dared to disagree with that title. However, Veronica Lake's tumble from that dizzying summit would go down in history as one of the entertainment industry's most jarring and rapid self-destructions. By the time the early 1950s rolled around, barely 10 years after her explosion onto the scene, Lake's career was already on life support. She had a notorious reputation for being a nightmare on set, but that combative attitude, combined with shifting trends, made her virtually unhireable. Yet the true catastrophe was unfolding behind closed doors far away from the director's chair. Lake's severe battle with the bottle began to aggressively erode her once immaculate visage. Those piercing blue eyes that once hypnotised men turned glassy, puffy and vacant. Her complexion, once compared to porcelain, became rough, bloated and weathered. Most tragically, her golden hair, her literal currency in Hollywood, became so brittle and fried from neglect that she was forced to chop off the peekaboo style, completely losing her identity in the process. The alcohol was essentially rotting her from the inside out, a sentiment echoed by her later co-star Richard Denning, who witnessed the decline firsthand. He noted that you could practically watch the structure of her face collapsing month by month like a time-lapse video of a wilting rose. By 1962, Lake hit absolute rock bottom when an inquisitive journalist discovered the former superstar working as a barmaid at the Martha Washington Hotel in New York City. The woman pouring gin and tonics was a shocking shadow of the sultry noir queen who had dominated the box office just 2 decades prior. Candid snapshots from this era reveal a woman with a swollen, heavy face and eyes that had sunk deep into her skull. She wore a mask of exhaustion and despair that made her appear 20 years older than the calendar suggested she should be. As film historian Margaret Wilson noted, she went from unforgettable to completely forgotten. and her physical ruin was the outward proof that the industry had discarded her. Lake attempted to claw her way back into the spotlight in the late 1960s, but the public actually recoiled at her appearance. That legendary oval face had succumbed to heavy jowls and bloating, while those knowing, seductive eyes were now empty windows. It was distressing to witness. Her skin bore the violent map of alcoholism and financial ruin, marked by broken capillaries and a sickly, yellowed pallor. When Lake finally passed away in 1973 at the young age of 50, she was battling hepatitis and acute kidney failure, the direct receipt for years of hard drinking. In the photographs taken near the end, the woman who was once a contender for the most beautiful human alive looked like a stranger, her features distorted by a lifetime of trauma and liquid abuse. What makes Lake's physical collapse so uniquely heartbreaking is how thoroughly it erased the specific trademark that made her a legend. The icon whose hair launched millions of copycats left this world with that signature style long gone and forgotten. Her allure had disintegrated to such a degree that even her most obsessive admirers would have walked right past her on the sidewalk without a second glance. As her friend and peer, Marsha Hunt, ruthlessly observed in a town where your face is your fortune, once that account goes bankrupt, they don't just forget you, they treat you like a pariah. It is almost as if the industry believes aging is a contagious disease they need to quarantine. Veronica Lake, once the girl with the flawless face, learned the brutal lesson that in Hollywood, perfection isn't just a requirement, it is a debt you are expected to pay forever. And when the pedestal finally cracks, the crash isn't just painful, it is absolutely catastrophic for everyone watching. Word on the street is that Addie Ross skipped town today, and she didn't leave empty-handed. She took a stolen husband along as a souvenir. Yeah. You sound thrillingly amused by the scandal. It reminds me of the time I told you we were serving lamb for dinner. Number 8. Linda Darnell, the celestial beauty that turned to ash. When a wide-eyed Linda Darnell first set foot in Tinseltown at the tender age of 15, studio moguls were so floored by her stunning visage that they immediately concocted a lie about her birth year. To dodge strict child labour regulations, the executives swore she was 17. With her impeccable olive complexion, soulful dark eyes and bone structure that defied geometry, Darnell was far more than just another pretty face in the crowd. She possessed a mesmerising exotic allure that the camera lenses simply devoured with an insatiable appetite. The head honcho at 20th Century Fox, Daryl F. Zanuck, famously crowned her as the girl with the perfect face, a title that would follow her forever. Throughout the glamour of the 1940s, that very face was the centrepiece of countless blockbuster hits, starring alongside legends like Tyrone Power in Blood and Sand and lighting up the screen in Forever Amber. Her aesthetic perfection was so undeniable that the legendary director Otto Preminger once declared, "The camera worships her face," suggesting she had a divine relationship with the lens. It was said to be nearly impossible to take a bad photograph of her. However, lurking beneath Darnell's flawless exterior were crippling insecurities that the public never saw. These internal demons would eventually pave the way for one of the most harrowing physical deteriorations in Hollywood history. The first hairline fractures in Darnell's porcelain facade started to show. By the early 1950s, the offers stopped pouring in as frequently. Like countless starlets confronting the industry's ruthless expiration date on youth, Darnell sought solace in the bottom of a bottle. The impact of her heavy drinking manifested rapidly, marring the complexion that had once been the envy of the world. That legendary luminous skin, which once needed zero retouching, began to suffer from severe bloating and unmistakable puffiness as the toxicity took hold. Linda was truly one of those genetic lottery winners who required almost no cosmetic enhancement, recalled Thomas Richards, her makeup artist from the glory days of the 1940s. But he noted that by 1952 or 53, the makeup team was working overtime, applying layers of product just to mimic the glow she used to have naturally. Her youthful freshness was evaporating much faster than anyone anticipated. As the doors to elite roles slammed shut, Darnell spiraled into a deep, dark cycle of depression. The toxic combination of alcohol abuse and yo-yo dieting sent her physical transformation into overdrive, ravaging her appearance. The svelte, statuesque silhouette that had been plastered across every major magazine cover was replaced by an increasingly heavy and unrecognisable frame. Her razor-sharp jawline vanished into softness, and those massive expressive eyes seemed to shrink, buried within a face that was changing shape entirely. The weight gain absolutely shattered her self-worth, confessed her close friend and co-star Constance Moore. You have to understand, Linda had been cast as the beauty her entire existence. When that identity began to crumble, she completely lost her sense of self, having no idea who she was without the validation of her looks. Candid photographs from the mid-1950s reveal a woman who looks virtually nothing like the ethereal goddess who ruled the screen just 10 years prior. That perfect oval face had become round and heavy, the sleek figure had thickened substantially, and most heartbreaking of all, the fire and confidence in her eyes had been extinguished. What makes Darnell's physical downfall so particularly gut-wrenching was the sheer velocity of it. It was tragically premature. Unlike many peers who battled the slow, natural creep of ageing over decades, Darnell's collapse happened with a shocking, violent speed. By the time she reached her late 30s, an age when many leading ladies are still commanding the screen, she looked haggard, worn out, and decades older than her birth certificate stated. The final horrific chapter of Darnell's story arrived with a brutal suddenness that no one could have predicted. In 1965, at the young age of 41, she was reportedly watching her own classic film Stardust on late-night TV when her house became an inferno. Darnell sustained catastrophic burns covering 90% of her body and succumbed to her injuries the very next day. The bitter irony of her final moments haunted everyone who knew her. The woman who was once idolised for having the perfect face perished while watching the ghost of her younger, breathtaking self flicker on a television screen. It was the ultimate tragic collision between Hollywood's false promise of immortality and the cruel, unforgiving reality of physical decay. As her friend and fellow actress Ruth Warwick later remarked, Linda became the living cautionary tale that every actress in town was terrified of becoming. The girl with the perfect face met her end in a nightmare of tragedy and scars, leaving a legacy of sorrow behind the glamour. The studio machine built her up as an infallible goddess, which meant that any human flaw she developed later appeared monstrously magnified. It was a cruel pedestal no human being could balance on forever. In perhaps the most chilling twist of fate, Darnell once told a reporter, "I don't want to wait until I'm 50 to start playing character parts." She added, "I'd rather be dead." It is devastating to realise that her dark wish was granted in the most terrible way imaginable. "Oh, so you think you've fallen in love for the very first time?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Well, then how do you verify it? How can you be certain of this feeling? You have absolutely no baseline to compare it against." Number 7. Tallulah Bankhead, the voice and visage that crumbled into dust. When the force of nature known as Tallulah Bankhead exploded onto the Hollywood scene in the 1930s, she wasn't just another beautiful face. She was absolutely electrifying, armed with sharp patrician features, a voice like smoke and whiskey, and a wit so scandalous it made executives sweat. Bankhead personified a sophisticated, dangerous sexuality that put her in a completely different league than the cookie-cutter studio starlets of the era. As the offspring of a powerful political dynasty, she carried a natural aristocratic swagger into her roles, dominating films like Lifeboat and conquering the stage in The Little Foxes. In her absolute prime, Bankhead boasted a unique angular beauty, high-cutting cheekbones, eyes that told 1,000 stories, and a tall, willow-thin figure that draped high fashion with effortless grace. Yet even more distinct than her striking looks was that voice, a deep melodious instrument that could purr like a kitten or command an army with equal terrifying effectiveness. But let's be clear, Tallulah Bankhead didn't just burn the candle at both ends. She took a flamethrower to the entire wax factory. She partied with a ferocity that made every other starlet of her era look like a choir girl pushing the limits of endurance harder than perhaps any other actress of her generation. And inevitably, the receipt for that life of hedonism was printed clearly on her visage-carving wreckage across her once stunning face in a way that horrified even her most loyal worshippers. Bankhead famously dropped one of the most legendary lines in Hollywood history. "My father warned me about men and booze, but he never mentioned a word about women and cocaine." While the press laughed, this wasn't just a clever soundbite, it was a dark prophecy and a terrifying glimpse into the specific vices that would systematically dismantle her health and erode her looks. We aren't talking about a casual social smoker here. Bankhead was a chimney allegedly torching through 100 cigarettes every single day for decades on end. That level of nicotine intake alone would have been sufficient to ruin anyone's complexion. But for Tallulah, it was merely the appetizer in a massive buffet of self-destruction. She drowned her system in bourbon around the clock, fueled her days with amphetamines, and wound down or up with regular doses of cocaine. On top of the chemical cocktail, her bedroom saw a revolving door of lovers, men and women alike, in sheer numbers that made even the most scandalous libertines of the time clutch their pearls. By the time she hit her early 40s, the physical evidence of this debauchery was undeniable. Her smooth, aristocratic skin began to crack, etching deep fissures around her mouth from the endless chain smoking. Her eyes, which had once been bright and piercing, turned heavy-hooded and perpetually bloodshot. But the most tragic loss was her voice. That signature sultry instrument degraded into a guttural rasp described brutally by one critic as the sound of a crow choking on sawdust and sandpaper. Her close friend and co-star Estelle Winwood pinpointed the tragedy, noting that the voice was the first treasure to be looted by her lifestyle. What used to be a velvet smooth, distinctive drawl turned into something jagged, harsh and grating to the ear. For those of us who knew her at her peak, listening to her speak wasn't just unpleasant, it was genuinely heartbreaking, a constant sonic reminder of what had been lost. As Bankhead barreled into her 50s, the physical decline went into freefall, accelerating at a shocking rate. That striking angular bone structure collapsed into a gaunt, wasted look as her body broke down and her skin lost all its porcelain luminosity, taking on a grim ashen grey tone that no amount of heavy stage paint could hide. She withered away to a frighteningly frail weight, looking almost skeletal, a shadow of the curvaceous figure she once cut. This ghostly appearance was made even more jarring by... perhaps the most gut-wrenching detail of her decline was the absolute ruin of her once dazzling smile, her teeth completely rotted away after years of severe neglect and rampant substance abuse. Whenever she popped up on television during those later years, audiences were genuinely horrified to see the decay in Bankhead's mouth every time she laughed or spoke a gruesome departure from the veneered perfection of the typical Hollywood starlet. By the time the 1960s rolled around and Bankhead stepped onto the set for her final cinematic roles, the physical metamorphosis was total and absolutely heartbreaking to witness. That sophisticated, radiant goddess of the stage was long gone. In her place stood a ghastly figure that director Ryan Thompson could only describe as a Halloween version of the icon she used to be. Her skin looked like parchment stretched too tight over a skeletal frame. Her legendary voice had curdled into a painful hacking rasp and her limbs jerked with a nervous, unpredictable energy. But the most jaw-dropping aspect of Bankhead's physical collapse wasn't just the visuals, it was her sheer, unadulterated denial of the situation. She absolutely refused to admit anything was wrong or to pump the brakes on her chaotic behaviour, ignoring every warning sign her body threw at her. Right up until she drew her last breath, she kept a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, famously cracking, "If I had to live my life again, I'd make the same mistakes, only sooner." When the curtain finally fell in 1968, Bankhead was only 66 years old, but her medical charts read like a war zone, with multiple fatal causes listed on the certificate. The coroner's report was a laundry list of self-inflicted wounds, including double pneumonia, advanced emphysema, severe malnutrition, and unchecked diabetes. Decades of debauchery had systematically dismantled her body from the inside out, as her niece, poignantly remarked later, Tallulah was a flame that burned incredibly hot, but far too fast. She crammed more living into a single 24-hour period than most civilians manage in a calendar year, but that level of intensity came with a devastating physical tax that eventually came due. Ultimately, the vibrant beauty morphed into a grim cautionary tale, proving that no amount of fame, talent or money can stop the Grim Reaper when you've spent a lifetime inviting him in. In her final interview, she remained defiant to the bitter end, declaring with her last bit of strength, "Nobody can say I didn't live." It is true, but the tragic footnote to her legacy is that nobody could say she aged with any sort of grace either. "I'm actually very organised, you know," she once insisted, defending her chaos. "You couldn't survive my life otherwise. Believe it or not, I am a hard-working actress travelling all over the globe." Now let's pivot to Zsa Gabor, a woman who went from being the ultimate natural glamour queen to a walking, talking silicone sculpture. When the Hungarian bombshell touched down in Hollywood back in the early 1940s, she didn't just arrive. She made an entrance, bringing a level of European sophistication that had the entire town gossiping instantly. With her trademark platinum blonde tresses, dangerous curves, and that thick, exotic accent, Gabor was much more than just another pretty face in the crowd. She was opulently, extravagantly stunning. In her prime, she possessed a magnetic, vivacious energy that didn't just enter a room, it illuminated it completely. That perfect heart-shaped face, those razor-sharp cheekbones and those captivating eyes made her a screen sensation in cult classics like Moulin Rouge and Touch of Evil. However, her acting chops often played second fiddle to her larger-than-life persona and her revolving door of husbands. With 9 marriages under her belt, she practically invented the concept of being famous just for being famous. "Darling, in my day, I was considered a great beauty," was the phrase Gabor famously purred to anyone who would listen, constantly reminding interviewers of her legendary status, even as she reached her twilight years. She never let the world forget that she was the original glamour queen, ensuring her past glory overshadowed the present reality. But beneath the diamonds and the bravado lay a heartbreaking truth about the price of vanity. The real tragedy was found in her frantic, almost desperate attempts to freeze time, fighting a losing battle to maintain an image of perfection that was simply impossible to hold on to forever. This obsession with staying young would eventually exact a heavy toll, warping her features over the decades. Tragically, the procedures intended to save her looks ended up transforming her into someone completely unrecognisable from the breathtaking natural stunner who had once captivated the entire world. Decades before influencers and reality stars normalised the nip-tuck lifestyle we see in 2026, Gabor was already blazing the trail. She was one of Hollywood's very first and most enthusiastic devotees of the scalpel-treating plastic surgery, not as a secret shame, but as a standard maintenance requirement for a diva. It started innocently enough in her 40s, just a few minor tweaks here and there to keep things tight, but that quickly spiralled into a relentless marathon of surgeries that would completely rewrite her face with every passing decade. When the 1970s rolled around, the shift wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was screaming for attention, and everyone could see that something fundamental was shifting. Her face, once famous for its mobility and charm, started getting that distinct pulled-tight look, while those legendary cheekbones of hers, originally her best asset, began to look less like good genetics and more like serious architectural engineering. Then there were the lips, which used to fit her face perfectly, but suddenly started swelling up, taking on that telltale, puffy bee-stung quality. It was the beginning of that over-injected, swollen aesthetic that would eventually become her trademark look for better or worse. Thomas Blake, who did her makeup back in the swinging 60s, put it best when he noted that Zsa had enough raw natural beauty to age gracefully and still knock everyone dead without a single nip or tuck. However, she was absolutely terrified of grey hairs and wrinkles, so every trip to the surgeon was a desperate attempt to freeze the clock, but instead of looking young, the cumulative effect just made her look indeterminate. It stopped looking like a specific age and started looking like something entirely separate from humanity. Things really went off the rails during the 1980s and 90s. If you look at the photos from that era, you see a face that's becoming progressively more rigid, like a beautiful mask that never moves. Those cheekbones didn't just pop, they practically exploded outward, giving her an intense, almost feline cast that was worlds away from her original soft features. Her eyes, which used to sparkle with so much emotion, were pulled back so tight from endless facelifts that she looked permanently startled, like she was caught in a constant state of shock. But the most jarring change was undoubtedly her mouth, which ballooned to such massive proportions that it barely looked like it belonged to the same woman anymore. That delicate, perfect Cupid's bow everyone admired in her prime was gone, replaced by a shapeless, inflated mass of filler that moved in a really unsettling way whenever she tried to talk. Celebrity photographer Richard Barnett, who spent decades pointing his lens at Gabor, didn't mince words, observing that she transitioned from being a legitimate glamour queen to becoming a living silicone sculpture. The heartbreaking part wasn't the surgery itself, but watching the actual Zaza fade away bit by bit, procedure by procedure. In her place stood this manufactured doll, an artificial creation that felt less like a human being and more like a walking caricature of stardom. What makes this whole downward spiral so sad is that it was completely self-inflicted and totally unnecessary. Cinema experts always point out that with her bone structure, she would have aged magnificently, likely carrying that same regal European elegance we saw in legends like Ingrid Bergman or Audrey Hepburn. But she couldn't handle the thought of getting older, so she chased these aggressive interventions that backfired spectacularly. Instead of preserving her look, she effectively scrubbed away every trace of the natural beauty she was trying so desperately to save. The final tragic act of her physical evolution began after a horrific car crash in 2002, followed by a stroke that left her partially paralysed and unable to hide from the public eye. Before she became completely reclusive, her last few outings were shocking. The combination of failing health and decades of extreme surgeries created a visage so distorted that fans were left heartbroken and stunned. By the time she passed away in 2016, at the ripe old age of 99, she had spent decades living as a ghostly shell of the woman she used to be. She was still there physically, sure, but she was virtually unrecognisable compared to the vibrant, captivating stunner who had once held all of Hollywood in the palm of her hand. Her close friend and fellow Hungarian starlet Eva Bartók nailed it when she said the real tragedy of Dada wasn't the ageing process itself. It was her paralysing terror of getting old that caused her to systematically delete her own features in a futile attempt to stop the clock. Those expensive surgeries didn't keep her young. All they did was strip away her unique identity and leave a stranger in its place. In a society that is still completely obsessed with youth and terrified of wrinkles, Zsa Gaba's extreme metamorphosis serves as a grim warning. It stands as a glaring testament to the irony that chasing eternal youth often destroys the exact beauty you're fighting so hard to keep alive. Next up at number 5, we have the heartbreaking tale of Judy Garland, the girl who was forced to grow up way too fast. When a 16-year-old Judy Garland went skipping down that yellow brick road back in 1939 for The Wizard of Oz, she instantly stole America's heart with that fresh face and a voice that could move mountains. She had those big, soulful brown eyes and an infectious grin that screamed "Girl Next Door," making her the wholesome antidote to the untouchable bombshells of that time. She wasn't an ice queen or a femme fatale. She was real, approachable, and totally different from the polished goddesses dominating the silver screen. But behind that sweet, innocent exterior, the studio machine was grinding away, setting into motion a series of events that wouldn't just wreck her looks, but would utterly shatter her spirit. It wasn't just about vanity. The system destroyed her health and eventually claimed her life, leading to one of the most gut-wrenching physical declines in Hollywood history. Right from the jump, the suits at MGM decided that Garland's natural appearance just wasn't going to cut it. The studio boss, Louis B. Mayer, known for being a tyrant, cruelly dubbed her "My Little Hunchback" and immediately put her on a strict, dangerous regimen of diet pills. Even though she was just a teenager, They were pumping her full of amphetamines to keep her energy up and her weight down, demanding she stay camera ready at all costs. And because the speed kept her wired, they fed her barbiturates to knock her out at night, trapping her in a vicious cycle of chemical addiction that started aging her face way before her time. Her Wizard of Oz co-star Ray Bolger later recalled that Judy was just a normal kid who looked like a normal kid, but that wasn't enough for the powers that be. The studio was obsessed with this weird paradox. They wanted her body to have the slim curves of an adult woman, but they insisted her face remain frozen in childhood innocence. It was a completely impossible destructive standard to meet naturally, so the pills became the only way to survive the demand. When you get down to it, they were literally feeding high-grade speed to a child and then acting shocked when the wheels started falling off. By the time she hit her 20s, the cracks were already showing. The relentless amphetamine abuse was carving itself into her features. Her signature rounded youthful cheeks, hollowed out, and deep dark circles began to permanently shadow those famous eyes. The porcelain complexion that had defined her early years didn't just fade. It seemed to evaporate under the glare of the spotlight. By the time she hit her 30s, the dehydration and relentless pressure had etched themselves deep into her features, marking the beginning of a truly harrowing physical decline. If you look at candid snapshots from the early 1950s, the person staring back doesn't look like a vibrant young starlet. She looks like a woman who has lived 10 hard years beyond her actual birth date. Her body was trapped in a vicious, chemical-fueled roller coaster of yo-yo dieting, where she would balloon up and shrink down with alarming speed, leaving her appearance in a constant chaotic state of flux. One week she would look skeletal, practically wasting away before the cameras, and the next she would be swollen and puffy, carrying the telltale bloat of heavy drinking and a toxic cocktail of prescription meds. While her silhouette shifted erratically, the exhaustion remained etched on her face. Her close friend and legendary performer Lena Horne put it bluntly, noting that the Hollywood machine had chewed Judy up and spat her out with every scar on full display for the world to see. It was heartbreaking to see her at 30, looking like a weary woman of 45. But to blame it all on the pills and the booze would be missing the bigger, darker picture. The real culprit was the crushing psychological weight she carried, the relentless pressure to perform, and the terrifying nagging fear that one bad show could mean being tossed aside like yesterday's trash. When she crossed into her 40s, time didn't just march on, it sprinted. That famous, lustrous chestnut mane lost its life, turning brittle and straw-like, forcing her to rely on heavy wigs to maintain the illusion of glamour on stage. The smooth canvas of her face was rewritten with deep, unforgiving crevices, particularly framing her eyes and mouth as if every tragedy she endured was being carved into her skin. This wasn't the graceful, natural progression of a woman in her 40s. These were the brutal battle scars of chronic insomnia, unmanageable stress, and a lifetime of chemical abuse taking their toll all at once. The most devastating change was in her eyes. Those once sparkling pools that captivated millions now looked haunted, reflecting a depth of exhaustion and inner torment that was impossible to hide. If you watch the close-ups from her television work in the 1960s, you can see the light had effectively gone out. That electric sparkle was replaced by a heavy, soulful weariness that broke the hearts of fans who remembered the girl she used to be. When the end finally came in 1969, resulting from an accidental overdose at the tender age of 47, the tragedy wasn't just in her death, but in the shocking condition of her body. Physically, she bore no resemblance to a woman in her 40s. She looked frail and weathered, more like a grandmother in her late 60s than a star in her prime. The coroner's report read like a horror story of internal wreckage. Her liver, heart and kidneys were failing, showing the kind of advanced deterioration you would expect in a geriatric patient, not a middle-aged woman. The bright-eyed girl from Kansas didn't just grow up, she was aged prematurely by the ruthless machinery of the very industry that had crowned her its queen. As entertainment journalist Richard Wilson so poignantly noted, Tinseltown did far more than just steal Judy's youth. It robbed her of her entire future before she even had a chance to live it. The very same pills shoved at her to keep her slender for the screen and peppy for the executives ended up being the thief that stole decades from her lifespan, aging her right in front of a horrified public. What makes witnessing Garland's physical disintegration so absolutely gut-wrenching is the realisation that this wasn't inevitable. It was entirely tragically preventable. This wasn't a case of a star partying too hard on their own accord. Garland's descent into premature old age was kick-started by studio-mandated abuse. She was fed amphetamines while she was still legally a child, a grotesque form of professional exploitation that rewired her system and set the stage for a lifetime of unwinnable struggles. During one of her very last sit-downs with the press, a reporter had the audacity to tactlessly point out just how much older she looked compared to her actual chronological age. Judy didn't shy away. Her response was sharp and revealed a painful, stinging awareness of exactly what had happened to her face and body. She simply said, "If you had lived my life, you would look older than your years too." That wasn't just a clever clapback or a defensive manoeuvre. It was the raw, unvarnished truth of a life lived through hell. Speaking of icons who carried the weight of the world in their gaze, we have to talk about the price fame extracted from Bette Davis. While Garland's tragedy was written in her skin for screen legend, Bette Davis, the story was told through those famous eyes that eventually dimmed with age and illness. She possessed arguably the most extraordinary, mesmerising pair of eyes in the entire history of Hollywood. As the renowned film critic Richard Corliss once observed about the legendary star, those massive expressive orbs were capable of conveying entire monologues without a single word, cementing Davis's status as an absolute titan of the golden age of cinema. When you paired those eyes with her sharp, distinctive bone structure and an aura that demanded respect, you got a unique kind of beauty. It wasn't the cookie-cutter pretty of the era, but it had a magnetic pull you simply couldn't resist. Back in her absolute prime, photographers would say she had the perfect geometry for the lens, a face built specifically for the high-contrast world of black and white film. It was a canvas that registered every fleeting micro-expression, allowing her to seize the audience's attention and hold it in a vice grip every time she appeared on screen. She might not have been a traditional pin-up bombshell, but her striking, intense looks in masterpieces like Jezebel, Dark Victory and now Voyager were unforgettable. These roles solidified her reputation not just as an actress, but as one of the most captivating and powerful forces of nature to ever grace the American silver screen. However, Davis is also famous for saying that old age ain't no place for sissies, a quote that would turn out to be a grim, self-fulfilling prophecy for her own later years. The physical metamorphosis she endured as the decades wore on was arguably one of the most dramatic and painful declines witnessed in the celebrity world. It was a perfect storm of Father Time's severe health emergencies and the cumulative toll of lifelong vices that eventually warped her famous features until she was almost unrecognisable. Davis was a relentless chain smoker from the time she was young. At the absolute peak of her addiction, reports suggest she was tearing through up to 4 packs of cigarettes every single day. That level of nicotine intake alone is enough to fast-track the ageing process, but for Bette, the smoking was just the tip of the iceberg in a punishing lifestyle. Her daily routine also involved heavy alcohol consumption and the non-stop pressure cooker environment of a Hollywood that demanded perfection at all costs. By the time she reached her late 40s, the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore, with the damage clearly mapping itself across her once striking visage. According to her longtime makeup artist, Robert Miller, the skin was the first thing to surrender. He recalled how that beautiful, expressive face began to etch with deep lines and creases far more severe than what was normal for a woman her age. The relentless smoking had destroyed her skin's elasticity so thoroughly that by the time she hit 50, her complexion had the texture and quality you would expect to see on someone 65 or 70 years old. Things went from bad to worse, accelerating dramatically when she entered her 60s and was hit by a barrage of devastating health crises that knocked her down one after another. The turning point came in 1983 while she was visiting France. She suffered a massive stroke that left the left side of her iconic face partially paralysed. Although she was a fighter and worked diligently through grueling rehabilitation, the stroke left a permanent haunting mark on her appearance that no amount of makeup could hide. The aftermath left permanent visible scars, most notably a distinct droop on the left side of her mouth that tragically slurred her legendary razor-sharp diction. As if that were not enough, a cruel twist of fate struck just weeks after the stroke when Davis received a breast cancer diagnosis that necessitated an immediate mastectomy. The 1-2 punch of these brutal health crises, compounded by the aggressive treatments they demanded, acted like a catalyst that fast-forwarded her aging process at a shocking rate. When she finally felt ready to step back into the spotlight, the fan base was completely unprepared for her startling metamorphosis. The most gut-wrenching loss for her admirers was the change in those iconic eyes, the very trademark that had anchored her dominance on the screen for decades. That electric, hypnotic stare, which had once commanded the attention of millions, seemed to have noticeably dimmed and lost its fire. The stroke had frozen certain facial muscles, subtly warping the shape of her eyes, while a lifetime of chain smoking had stained the once pristine whites with a jaundiced yellow hue. But the greatest tragedy was in the movement. The neurological damage had stolen the dynamic mobility that once made her slightest glance so lethal and captivating. Her genius remained intact, but her vessel was broken, a sentiment echoed by Lillian Gish, her co-star in The Whales of August. Witnessing Bet battle against her own failing physiology was painful, akin to watching a virtuoso pianist attempt a concerto with fingers crippled by severe arthritis. The creative fire was still burning bright, but the physical instrument she relied on had sadly gone out of tune and betrayed her. Yet, true to her nature, Davis refused to cower in the shadows or retire from the public gaze despite her altered visage. She marched forward, taking on roles that often placed an uncomfortable spotlight on the stark contrast between her current frailty and her legendary beauty of the past. By 1987, in her swan song performance for The Whales of August, the lens was unforgiving, capturing close-ups that exposed the brutal reality of her decline. The camera lingered on deep crevices, sparse thinning hair, and those famous orbs now clouded, weary, and stripped of their former intensity. What made Davis's physical deterioration so incredibly poignant was that she was completely and painfully aware of every bit of it. Unlike many fading stars who lived in a state of delusion about their changing looks, Davis addressed her reality with her trademark no-nonsense bite. When a reporter dared to ask a tactless question about her haggard appearance, she snapped back that she had earned every single one of those damn wrinkles. And she made it clear she had no intention of masking them now. During her final rounds on the public stage before her passing in 1989, the transformation of Bette Davis was both absolute and profoundly shocking to behold. The powerhouse presence of her prime had withered into a frail silhouette, yet she still harboured the ferocious fighter's spirit that was the hallmark of her career. Her physical shell had been hollowed out by decades of hard liquor, heavy smoking and high-stress living, leaving a ghost that bore little resemblance to the vibrant star of the 1940s, as her longtime friend and peer Olivia de Havilland observed after Davis passed away. Bette confronted her physical ruin with the same grit and unflinching courage she applied to every other battle in her life. She stared down the lens without vanity. Even when seeing her own reflection must have been agonising, there was a raw heroism in her refusal to fake it. In a town built on smoke and mirrors, Davis's visible decay served as a grim memento mori to the industry. It stood as a testament to the heavy physical toll exuded by a lifetime of living hard and working even harder. The gaze that once enslaved the world had gone dark, but the indomitable soul behind those eyes remained unconquered to the very end. I beg your pardon, I am Mrs. Stephen Haynes. Sorry, I do not think I know you. Number 3. Joan Crawford. The mask that eventually shattered. When Joan hit Tinseltown in the roaring 20s, she packed more than just drive. She brought a face that would sculpt an era. She possessed massive saucer-like eyes, a mouth with distinct character, and razor-sharp cheekbones that cut glass. Crawford's look was so etched in stone that you could identify her instantly just by seeing her silhouette cast in shadow. Through the 1930s and into the 40s, that mug carried massive blockbusters ranging from Grand Hotel to her Oscar-snatching performance in Mildred Pierce. What set Crawford's beauty apart was that it felt structural, almost architectural, rather than merely pretty. Her features were bold and clearly defined, engineered to catch the light dramatically from any conceivable angle. While her rivals sported soft, rounded and demure looks, Joan was all modern lines, intensity and unmistakable power. As George Harrell, the legendary lensman behind her most definitive portraits, famously noted, Joan was built for lighting and shadows. It was virtually impossible to capture a bad angle of those perfectly constructed features. However, her fanatical obsession with freezing time would eventually turn her into a grotesque caricature, a warning to anyone who refuses to make peace with nature. From the jump, Crawford was infamous for a beauty regimen that bordered on the pathological. Rumour had it her morning ritual involved dousing her face with ice-cold water exactly 25 times without fail. She also layered on abrasive astringents and alcohol-heavy toners that tightened her pores for the moment but destroyed her skin's elasticity in the long run. Joan was fighting an all-out war against wrinkles before she even had a single line on her face. Her longtime makeup guru Richard Anderson later admitted the irony of it all. The aggressive anti-aging tactics she employed in her 30s were actually accelerating the decay, destroying her skin long before the damage bubbled to the surface. Once she crossed the threshold into her 50s, the disastrous consequences of her aggressive beauty rituals started to backfire in a major way. Decades of abrasive scrubbing and chemical stripping had completely depleted her face of its necessary moisture, leaving behind a texture that looked less like skin and more like thin, dried-out parchment paper stretched too tight. Then there was the absolute catastrophe with her brows, which she had ruthlessly tweezed into non-existence during the skinny brow craze of the 1930s, only to later pencil them back on in those severe theatrical arches. The hair follicles eventually gave up the ghost and never recovered, trapping her in a vicious cycle where she had to sketch them on daily, resulting in a harsh, artificial look that actually added years to her face rather than taking them away. As the calendar pages turned, her fixation on maintaining that movie star facade shifted from a professional requirement to a frantic, all-consuming obsession. Her daughter, Christina Crawford, famously revealed in her tell-all that what used to be a 60-minute morning routine ballooned into a marathon 3-hour ordeal where her mother wasn't just applying makeup, she was practically constructing a completely new face from scratch. She would pile on endless strata of creams and powders, employing complex shading tricks and temporary tapes to hoist everything upward, a process that felt less like cosmetic enhancement and more like a soldier strapping on heavy battle gear for war. To make matters significantly worse, Crawford's notorious and well-documented relationship with the bottle was hitting the accelerator on her physical decline, speeding up the aging clock in the most brutal way possible. Years of hard liquor intake resulted in chronic dehydration, a web of burst capillaries and persistent facial bloating imperfections that were becoming impossible to ignore on a canvas that was once celebrated as absolutely flawless. In a desperate bid to hide the ravages of the alcohol, she troweled on the foundation even thicker, resulting in a stiff, impenetrable mask that seemed to harden and separate her from reality more and more as time went on. When the swinging 1960s rolled around, Joan's aesthetic had morphed into something unsettlingly distinct and far removed from her golden era. It reached a point where renowned film historian David Thompson characterised her look as a grotesque caricature, essentially describing it as a living parody of the stunning beauty she used to possess. That legendary razor-sharp jawline that had cut glass in her prime now looked unnaturally stiff, almost as if it had been locked into place by invisible wires. Her iconic mouth, always coated in that trademark dark crimson lipstick, appeared frozen in a permanent, bizarre rictus that barely seemed to articulate properly when she delivered her lines. But the most shocking change was in her eyes, those massive, mesmerising pools that made her a star, which were now ringed with so much heavy liner and shadow that she walked around with a permanent wide-eyed expression of sheer terror. And those painted-on eyebrows didn't help. She sketched them in such severe, high-pitched arches that they completely ignored where a human brow bone should actually sit. This geometric disaster only amplified that frightened look to a level that was frankly disturbing to witness, marking the definitive end of her days as a conventional beauty. Yet the internal fire and bitterness remained, and her nemesis and co-star in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the legendary Bette Davis, had plenty to say about it. Davis pointedly remarked on Joan's drastic physical metamorphosis, noting that it seemed fueled by a furious rage against the dying of the light and a frantic, tragic need to cling to a youth that had long since departed. As she entered her twilight years, the situation turned genuinely tragic. Her body began to fail her, rapidly coinciding with a painful dry spell in Hollywood roles and a terrifying instability in her bank account. Unable to bear the scrutiny or the rejection, she essentially locked the doors and withdrew into the shadows, cutting herself off from the world that used to worship her. On the very rare occasions she did step out in the early 1970s, the public was left reeling, unable to reconcile this figure with the glittering screen siren they remembered from the golden age just a few decades prior. According to her biographer, Charlotte Chandler, by the time the end was near, she had become virtually unrecognisable even to the die-hard fans who had followed her career religiously. That distinct architectural face that defined an era had been dismantled by a toxic cocktail of Father Time vodka and frantic cosmetic tampering, turning her into a stranger in her own skin. If you look at the final set of paparazzi shots from 1974 snapped just before she went into total seclusion, the evidence is undeniable. The metamorphosis is complete, and frankly, it is absolutely gut-wrenching to behold. Those incredible bones that the cameras once loved are virtually invisible now, buried under inches of thick pancake makeup. Her skin tells a confused story, pulled painfully tight in some spots while collapsing and drooping in others, betraying the structural failure underneath. Her lips and eyebrows painted on with shaky precision look like they don't even belong to the face underneath, appearing completely detached from her expressions. But the real tragedy is in the eyes. Those orbs that used to burn with fierce ambition now just look exhausted and lost, peeking out from behind a stiff, inanimate facade. When she finally passed away in 1977, she commanded one last directive to ensure her legacy: absolutely no open casket and 0 photographs allowed at the funeral. It was the ultimate power move of image preservation from a woman who had dedicated every waking moment to micromanaging exactly how the public perceived her. Her horrifying physical evolution stands as a brutal monument to the psychological damage inflicted by a ruthless industry that treats youth as currency and disposes of anyone who dares to age. Crawford actually predicted her own fate years earlier when she dropped this chilling truth bomb: women's faces are nothing but lies. She believed that if you plastered on enough paint, you could convince men of anything, even the impossible fantasy that a woman can remain frozen in time forever. Oh, absolutely. Down there, they are all just waiting for the princess to arrive. Moving on to number 2, Gloria Swanson, the audacious choice to age naturally in a world completely addicted to artifice. Back in the roaring 1920s, Gloria Swanson wasn't just a star. She was the undisputed monarch of the silent screen, possessing a beauty so flawless that legendary director Cecil B. DeMille refused to shoot her the standard way, while other actresses demanded to be filmed only from their good side. DeMille insisted on capturing Swanson from every conceivable angle because, frankly, she didn't have a bad one. With skin that seemed to glow from within and enormous soulful eyes, she was the breathing definition of Tinseltown glamour, mesmerising global audiences in blockbusters like Male and Female and The Hummingbird. When the silent era crashed and burned, taking countless careers with it, Swanson was one of the few survivors who managed to make the leap into the world of talking pictures without stumbling. Although the blinding heat of her fame cooled off during the 1930s, she was merely preparing for a resurrection that would go down in history. When she stormed back onto the screen as the delusional Norma Desmond in the 1950 classic Sunset Boulevard, Swanson had hit the half-century mark. She was 50 years old. In that era, being 50 usually meant you were either forced into playing grandmothers or pushed into early retirement, but Swanson refused to follow that script. What cements her spot on this list is her sheer audacity. While her peers were destroying themselves with bad habits or botched surgeries, Swanson made the radical, almost punk rock decision to let nature take its course. It was a polarising move, one that garnered applause for its bravery while simultaneously causing the public to gasp at the sheer visual aftermath. You have to remember, Tinseltown was absolutely not ready to handle the raw, unfiltered reality of getting older. According to cinema historian Patricia Morrison, Swanson's staunch refusal to go under the knife earned her respect in some highbrow circles. But for the die-hard fans, it was a jarring, almost heartbreaking departure from the porcelain doll they worshipped. In a town built on smoke mirrors and eternal youth, her decision to let nature take its course felt like a radical act of rebellion, making every wrinkle seem infinitely more pronounced against the backdrop of artificial preservation. Don't get it twisted, though. As she moved into her golden years, Gloria wasn't letting herself go. She was actually obsessively dedicated to wellness. We're talking about a strict vegetarian regimen, religious workout routines, and a total ban on booze and cigarettes lifestyle choices that you'd assume would be the fountain of youth. And sure, if you stood her next to the other starlets who were chain-smoking and knocking back martinis for breakfast, she was winning on the internal health front. Her constitution was ironclad and her physical vitality was undeniable. But here is the cruel twist. All the kale and cardio in the world couldn't stop gravity from doing its work on a face that was once defined by its absolute flawlessness. Fast forward to the 1960s. Swanson is in her 6th decade, and the metamorphosis from the silent screen siren to an aging mortal was not just visible, it was practically a different species. That legendary, perfectly sculpted oval face had surrendered to the inevitable sagging of time, while her once glassy forehead became a map of deep-set grooves, chronicling 7 decades of emotional highs and lows. The real giveaway, however, was the neck, that traitorous body part most actresses wear scarves to hide. Gloria's displayed the loose skin and corded bands that scream senior citizen completely unfiltered. She had the audacity to stare Father Time right in the eyes without blinking. Yet as her close friend and screen legend Lillian Gish brutally pointed out, time is an indifferent beast that simply does not care how brave you are. In the warped reality of Los Angeles, seeing a human being actually age is somehow more grotesque to the public than the freakish results of plastic surgery, simply because it's become such a rarity. Gloria was exhibiting a level of gutsiness that is rare in showbiz, daring to present herself exactly as she existed in the moment. This fearlessness took centre stage during her television spots in the 1970s, when she was navigating her 70s in high definition. While icons like Joan Crawford were practically locking themselves in dark towers to avoid being seen with a wrinkle, Swanson was out there chatting on talk shows, radiating a confidence that completely ignored the industry's expiration dates. But we can't ignore the jarring visual disconnect between the ethereal, fresh-faced deity of the silent era and the withered, authentic woman she had evolved into. The difference was nothing short of theatrical. If you put a photo of her from the Roaring Twenties next to a still from her 1970s TV cameos, the transformation is so total that a passerby might bet money they were looking at 2 completely different bloodlines. However, unlike the plastic surgery disasters we usually discuss, Swanson's disfigurement was simply the honest, brutal truth of human biology. It just felt like a tragedy to the public because her peak beauty had been so incredibly high up on the pedestal. Director George Cukor, a longtime pal, nailed it when he noted that film creates a cruel illusion, freezing youth in amber and setting up expectations that no living human can meet. The truth is, Gloria in her 70s looked precisely like what a vibrant, healthy 70-year-old woman is supposed to look like. The horror only exists because our brains are glitching, trying to reconcile that grandma with the celluloid ghost who stays forever 25 and pristine. Swanson's saga is a masterclass in the lose-lose situation Hollywood forces upon its aging queens. If you slice up your face, you're mocked for looking like a monster. If you let nature take the wheel, you're shamed for letting yourself go, just for having a pulse and growing older. In her memoirs published in 1980, Swanson tackled this hypocrisy head on. She didn't mince words addressing the impossible standards with her trademark bluntness. She wrote about watching countless peers imprison themselves in a desperate, clawing attempt to cling to a sex appeal that had long since expired. She argued it was far more dignified to embrace the evolution of self and find beauty in wisdom than to construct a horrific wax figure parody of one's youth. When she eventually passed in 1983 at 84 years old, the papers couldn't help themselves. Every obituary ran those brutal side-by-sides, practically begging readers to gawk at how far the mighty had fallen. What these trashy comparisons failed to mention was that Swanson's so-called terrible ageing was just the standard life cycle of a mammal. It only looked tragic because the Dream Factory had brainwashed us all into believing that women are supposed to be immortal vampires. As Nancy Olson, her co-star from the legendary Sunset Boulevard, later reflected on the matter. Gloria did the unthinkable. She aged with grace and dignity in a business that views wrinkles as a moral failing and a sign of giving up. So perhaps her true mark on the world isn't just the celluloid she left behind, but rather her sheer bravery in daring to exist as a fully formed aging human being inside a machine designed to strip humanity away. As the famous line goes, "I'm sorry you think more of your diamonds than you do of your soul. I'm sorry you think more of my soul than you do of my diamonds." Number one on our list brings us to Mae West, the explosive bombshell who absolutely refused to let the spark die out. When Mae West first strutted her stuff onto the silver screen back in the 1930s, she didn't just arrive. She brought a raw, unapologetic sexuality that flipped Hollywood on its head. Armed with a waist you could wrap one hand around platinum locks and a face beaten for the gods, West crafted a persona that was equal parts glamour queen and street smart rebel. In legendary flicks like She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel, her heavy-lidded gaze and double entendre dialogue created a scandalous package that drove Depression-era crowds wild. But unlike the legions of starlets who were merely flash-in-the-pan beauties, Mae West was never just a pretty face. She was a cultural phenomenon who blended devastating good looks with a tongue sharper than a switchblade and a personality that constantly tested the limits of what was acceptable. More than just being eye candy, she owned her sexuality, completely wielding a kind of independence and autonomy that was practically unheard of for women on the silver screen back in those days. Understanding that specific power dynamic is key to grasping why, out of every Hollywood legend we are covering, Mae's evolution, or lack thereof, in her twilight years stands out as the most shocking and, frankly, a bit disturbing. You see, for a woman like Mae, the concept of aging did not involve maturing or shifting into grandmotherly roles like her peers. Instead, she effectively tried to freeze time, locking her persona in amber and refusing to let reality chip away at the facade. As her longtime costume designer Robert Thomas revealed, she was hell-bent on keeping that sex pop bombshell vibe alive and kicking well into her 80-year-old glory. While her contemporaries were gracefully bowing out or accepting roles that matched their greying hair, Mae dug her heels in, insisting on remaining exactly the same. She continued to inhabit the skin of the insatiable man-eater she made famous in her 30s, clinging to the exact same visual aesthetic, even though 50 long years had rolled on by. This absolute refusal to let the crown slip forced her into increasingly drastic and bizarre lengths to fight off the inevitable march of time and biology. By the time she hit her 60s, those famous natural blonde locks were long gone, swapped out for a collection of massive, intricate platinum wigs that seemed to defy gravity and grow more outrageous with every calendar flip. The delicate, enhancing makeup techniques of her golden era were discarded in favour of trowel-heavy applications. She was trying to paint her youth back onto her face, but the result wasn't rejuvenation. It was an eerie, mask-like visage that sat uncomfortably on her skin. Perhaps the most glaring issue was her wardrobe, which stayed frozen in time, completely ignoring the changing fashions or her changing body since the 1930s. We are talking about body-hugging gowns, flamboyant feather boas, and sky-high platform heels, looks that screamed sex appeal when she was young, but created a harsh, jarring dissonance against the reality of her advanced years. Fast forward to the 1970s with May now in her 80s, and the visual transformation had morphed into something complete and deeply unsettling for onlookers. Film critic Richard Matthews, who had the rare opportunity to sit down with West during this twilight era, recalled the experience with a mix of awe and discomfort. He noted that her platinum wig had evolved beyond hair entirely. It was more like an architectural construct, a towering structure that looked nothing like anything that grows from a human scalp. The layers of makeup were so thick and caked on that they formed a stiff, immobile shell, barely cracking or shifting even when she tried to speak. And that legendary hourglass silhouette, it was only held together by what could be described as industrial-grade corsetry, constricted so tightly that moving naturally was out of the question. The final product was less a living woman and more of a walking wax museum exhibit, a three-dimensional simulation of Mae West, rather than the human being underneath. If you look at photos from that decade, you see a face buried under so much powder and paint that she resembles a shop mannequin, with cartoonishly exaggerated features locked in a permanent expression. Comedian Phyllis Diller, known for her own sharp wit, once observed that May looked like a wax figure that was slowly melting right in front of your eyes. Diller made this remark after bumping into West at a Hollywood industry bash in the late 1970s, noting that the spectacle was a strange cocktail of tragic and undeniably impressive. You have to admire, in a way, the sheer unadulterated willpower it took to keep that level of delusion going strong every single day. Things reached a fever pitch with her final movie role in the 1978 flick Sextet, filmed when she was 85, which turned out to be a cringe-inducing ordeal even for her die-hard fan base. Cast as an irresistible siren chased by hunks a third of her age, West hobbled across the screen, her range of motion visibly strangled by those merciless corsets. Her face was frozen by the heavy spackle of makeup, and if you listen closely, her lines were painfully dubbed in post-production because her real voice had grown too shaky to carry that signature sultry purr. Yet what makes this whole saga so heartbreakingly poignant is that this refusal to change was actually a reflection of her rebellious, revolutionary spirit. Even as the visual result veered into the grotesque, the intention behind it was pure defiance. The same trailblazer who spat in the face of sexual prudence in the 1930s was now spitting in the face of the rule that says old ladies should just fade into the wallpaper. As her biographer Charlotte Chandler put it, May simply refused to give the concept of aging the time of day. There was a twisted kind of feminism in her stubborn insistence on staying sexually viable and relevant. She held onto this stance long after society had decided that women with her birth date should be knitting in rocking chairs, not flirting on screen. Sure, the execution got weirder by the year, but that underlying grit was 100% Mae West. When she finally passed in 1980, at 87 years old, she had kept that bombshell act up until her very last breath. Insiders say that even at the end, she was still enduring hours of elaborate beauty rituals. She was still strapping on the platinum wig, squeezing into the tight gowns and demanding to be worshipped as the sex goddess she was 50 years prior. As the brilliant cultural critic Susan Sontag later noted, what happened to West wasn't just vanity. It represented a dual reality, the crushing tragedy of Hollywood's impossible beauty standards, and simultaneously a strange triumphant act of sheer will. Mae West built a larger-than-life character in her youth, but as the years ticked by, that character hardened into a prison cell. However, she was the warden of her own jail. She decorated that cell with gold and feathers and flat out refused to admit the walls were closing in. When you really think about it, there is something equally horrifying and deeply admirable about that level of commitment. For us watching today, looking back at clips from her final years, the massive gap between how she saw herself and the physical reality on screen makes for some seriously uncomfortable viewing. But it also challenges us to ask a tough question. Why do we find it so creepy when an elderly woman dares to present herself as desirable? That cringe factor says just as much about our own messed up cultural hang-ups regarding ageing as it does about Mae's eccentric life choices. By refusing to go gently into that goodnight West became the ultimate extreme case study of Hollywood's toxic and complicated love affair with youth and beauty. Her life story serves as a dark cautionary fable about the dangers of living in deep denial about the aging process. Yet simultaneously, her choices were a bold, unapologetic act of rebellion, a brazen middle finger raised high against the cruel rules of society. She fiercely rejected the sexist expectation that women should just quietly disappear and gracefully fade into the background once their youthful bloom has withered away. Instead, she fought to remain visible, refusing to let the world retire her just because she had grown older.